Welcome back to 1834, chess friends. It's McDonnell versus labourdonnais, and McDonnell is winning 4-2. He only needs to win one more game in order to win the whole second match. And of course, labourdonnais will need to win 3 in a row from here in order to take it away from him. So let's hope that McDonnell can do it. But before we start, it's time to look at another chess meme. Here we go. It's funny because the horse can't move anywhere. Anyway, let's begin. We have e4 and c5. And of course, at this point, everybody is screaming at McDonnell not to do his usual f4 attack here, because it never works out for him and he always loses. So of course, McDonnell plays f4. And okay, from here, the moves are, for about the next 10 moves, are about the same as what we've been used to. So let's just zoom through them quickly. e6, knight to f3, knight to c6, c3, d5, and e5, f6, knight to a3, knight to h6, knight back to c2, queen to b6, as labourdonnais likes to do now. We have d4 in the center, bishop to d7, and h4 from McDonnell. And here we have c captures on d4, c captures on d4. And here we're used to the bishop coming out to here, delivering a check, and then the king moving to f2, and then across eventually to the h3 square. But here, instead, we have knight to f5, which is something different from labourdonnais. Morphy, commenting in 1859, he says, he ought rather to have checked with the king's bishop, as in the other games. Well, okay, so maybe there's chances here for McDonnell, we'll see. So he doesn't need to move his king straight away necessarily, but he decides to anyway, king to f2. We have h5 here, and now g3. I think usually the king comes over the top here, but of course the knight's blocking it now, so he can't do that. He's going to try to go behind the pawns this time. Okay, we'll carry on. We have castling queenside from labourdonnais, and now king to g2. It's almost like he's manually castling here. We have bishop to e7, developing the other bishop, and a3, and it seems like McDonnell would like to push all his queenside pieces towards the queenside castled king and try to make an attack out of this. Let's hope that he can do it. Labourdonnais just plays his bishop back to e8. He's hoping to come to g6 and then peer down on this very nice light square diagonal. But McDonnell just plays b4 here, continuing to push on the queenside, and Labourdonnais decides to tuck his king more nicely behind the queenside pawns here. But McDonnell, he just keeps pushing, b5, attacking the knight, and this is backed up by the light square bishop here, and if you look, you'll notice that it's not been developed yet, but it's still doing a good job, so nicely done. So the knight's under attack, it moves to a5, out of the way, knight to e3, and labourdonnais brings his bishop to g6 as we expected, and McDonnell decides to develop his light square bishop here to d3, but labourdonnais goes for the capture on e3, an exchange of knights. This allows McDonnell to develop his dark square bishop, although it is blocked in by these pawns on the dark squares, so maybe not that great. Here, instead of capturing the bishop, labourdonnais brings his bishop to e4, which is much more annoying. McDonnell captures the bishop and the pawn captures, and this is even more annoying, attacking the knight, so the knight moves out of the way, and it is attacking the pawn back, but he might not be able to capture it straight away. We have f captures, and now you'll notice that because the light square bishop is gone, this pawn is now hanging, and labourdonnais picks it up with the queen. We have queen to f1, offering a queen exchange, but again, labourdonnais doesn't want to go for this. He does something a bit more annoying. He goes to d3, and we have a queen exchange, and once more, this irritating pawn comes forward, and there's nothing attacking it anymore, so it might hang around here for a little bit longer. Now we have rook on h to b1, x-raying the king behind the pawn, and labourdonnais plays rook to c8. Now here, McDonnell decides that it's looking enough like an endgame that he'd like to centralize his king, and maybe also go after this very annoying pawn. So king to f3, and here labourdonnais infiltrates McDonnell's position, whilst also offering some protection to the pawn. McDonnell says, I can infiltrate just as well as you can, rook to b5. And this is attacking the knight on the edge here, so labourdonnais gives it a bit of protection with bishop to d8. McDonnell continues his plan of centralizing his king and going after this pawn with king to e4, and we have a6 from labourdonnais attacking this rook. And it turns out that McDonnell didn't really infiltrate the position, he has to retreat it, and he goes all the way back to b1. Now we have bishop to e7 again, and a4 from McDonnell. And this a4 move prompts Morphy to comment. He says, "This is a mere loss of time. He should have moved his rook to b6 at once." Okay, Morphy, he didn't. He played a4 first. And now we have rook across to d8, and now rook to b6. McDonnell saying, "Sorry, Morphy, it's better late than never." I don't think Morphy's happy regardless. Labourdonnais plays his rook back to c6, offering a rook exchange, and he's also left this pawn undefended, so maybe McDonnell will be able to get rid of this danger once and for all sometime soon. He doesn't go for it straight away, and he also doesn't go for the rook exchange straight away. Instead, he brings his other rook to b1, finally doubling up on this x-ray, and Labourdonnais just gets out of its way. And now we have the rook exchange on c6, finally capturing with the knight here. And again, McDonnell doesn't capture the pawn. He moves his rook to the open file on f1 first. We have bishop to b4 attacking the knight, but it's already nicely defended by the dark square bishop, so McDonnell doesn't worry about it. He also doesn't worry about capturing the pawn just yet. Instead, he plays rook to f7 with check, again briefly infiltrating Labourdonnais' position, but Labourdonnais just blocks it with a rook, and we have a rook exchange. And now, knight to f3, the bishop comes back to e7, and finally McDonnell picks up the very annoying pawn, so good job, he's got rid of that. He's got rid of that problem. We now have knight to b4 with check, so McDonnell moves the king out of the way to e4, but Morphy comments, he says, "White's left wing is weaker than his antagonist's, who has 2 pawns on that side of the board. Under these circumstances, it would have been better play to have moved the king in that direction." King to c4 was the correct play. Okay, Morphy, he played king to e4 instead, and we have knight to d5. This is attacking the bishop, so bishop back to d2, b5, a captures, king to d3 again, and now king to e8. The bishop here comes to g5, and this leads to bishop exchange, ending with the knight capturing the bishop. And now we have king back to d7, knight to e4, king to c6, knight to c5, knight to c7, and now king to e4. However, Morphy comments here, he says, knight to e4 was the proper move. Although having said that, the engine actually prefers knight to b3, getting in front of this pawn. However, McDonnell did indeed play king to e4, and now we have b4 and king back to d3. But Morphy comments here, he says, knight captures on e6. The move intended, we suppose, when the king was played to e4, would have been of no avail. Suppose the knight captures back, the pawn forks the king and the knight, the king moves, the pawn captures the knight, the king captures the pawn, the white king comes across to d4, and we have b3, king to c3, king captures the central pawn, the king captures the black pawn on the left wing, then king to f5 and wins, because he's going to pick up all these white pawns and the 2 black pawns are going to queen. Okay, thank you for that, Morphy. That was a losing line for McDonnell. So let's go back to b4 and king to d3. We have king to d5 now and knight to e4. Now, up to this point, before this move, this game has been very even. It's been very drawish throughout. But with this move, the engine says that this is now badly losing for McDonnell. So very sad. It prefers knight to a4, keeping an eye on stopping this pawn. It has a chance of stopping this from getting across and then trying to nullify everything on the other side of the board. But this move, knight to e4 at this point, loses track of this pawn. We continue with knight to b5, and we have g4, h-pawn captures, and here Morphy has got some more lines for us that are all losing for McDonnell. I'm not going to torture you with all of them. I'm just going to show you the first one. So he says that suppose knight to f6 with check, the pawn captures, then pushing this pawn to h5, f-pawn captures, and now h6, then this knight comes across the board as the pawn approaches the queening square, and it's in time to be able to stop the pawn or capture it once it's queen. So losing for McDonnell, very sad. So let's go back to the actual game. We have the pawn being pushed to h5, and now the knight captures the central pawn, and there's not really much left for McDonnell to do. He just pushes the h-pawn, which immediately gets captured. One last ditch effort from McDonnell. He checks the king, but it is free to pick up the last remaining white pawns, which is very sad. McDonnell goes for the fork here whilst capturing the g pawn, so the king has to move back to d5 it goes, and we have knight captures on h6, but at this point it seems McDonnell had a change of heart, decided enough was enough, and he resigned the game. So he's still up 4-3, winning 4-3. He only needs one more game. Labourdonnais will need another 2, so McDonnell still has a good chance, a good advantage here. Let's just hope that he can get it over the line. I'm sure he was very embarrassed after this game and wanted to remain anonymous as he left the hall, so he put on his shades and got out of there quick, sharp. So why did he resign in this position? Well, I think he realised it was going to be a slow, relentless grind that Labourdonnais would just inevitably win, and there wouldn't be anything that he could do to stop it. So he decided to cut his losses and retire early. To give you an impression of what could possibly happen from this point, I'm just going to play through the moves as the end music plays you out. So I'll see you next time for game number 8.